Like metallic rain falling on a city of neon dreams, our stories are both beautiful and piercingly cold. Experience the raw intensity of urban drama through a unique and cinematic lens of high-tech art. Hit subscribe now and feel every drop of the narrative.
The cab pulled up to the curb, and I sat there for a full 3 seconds before I could make myself open the door. 6 months on a drilling platform off the coast of Newfoundland does something to you. You stop expecting comfort. You stop expecting warmth, but you never stop expecting home to still be there when you get back. I stepped out with my duffel over one shoulder, and the first thing I saw was the lockbox, a bright orange realtor's lockbox, clamped to the front door handle of the house I had bought with 4 years of offshore rotations, missed Christmases, and a savings discipline that bordered on obsessive. A small white sign was staked into the flower bed I had planted myself the spring before I left. Under contract, standing on the porch, scrolling through their phones like they were waiting for a rideshare, were my mother and my sister Danny. My mother looked up first. She didn't wave. She smiled the way someone smiles when they've been rehearsing the expression for weeks and are finally getting to use it. "You're early," she said. "I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I want you to understand the kind of person I was before that driveway. I was the one who sent money home every rotation. I was the one who called on Sundays even when the satellite connection made it sound like we were talking through a tunnel filled with bees. I was the one who paid the deposit on Danny's apartment when she lost her job, who wired money for my mother's dental work without being asked twice. I had spent the better part of my adult life making sure everyone around me was okay. And I had done it so consistently that somewhere along the way they had stopped thinking of it as generosity. They started thinking of it as supply. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I have spent the last 6 years as a mechanical technician on deep water oil rigs, working 28 days on and 28 days off, living in a bunk the size of a walk-in closet, eating cafeteria food at 2 in the morning, and banking almost everything I made because there is genuinely nothing to spend money on in the middle of the North Atlantic. I had bought the house 3 years ago. A 1940s craftsman bungalow in a neighborhood that was just starting to turn around. I had done most of the renovation work myself on my off rotations, learning to tile because I couldn't afford a contractor, learning to patch plaster because I found it meditative. The house was mine in a way that nothing else in my life was. It was the proof that all of it, the isolation, the danger, the months of waking up not entirely sure what day it was, had been worth something. I had been unreachable for the last 9 days. A storm system had knocked out reliable communication on the platform, and I'd had spotty contact at best. I didn't think much of it. That kind of blackout happened 2 or 3 times a year. Now I understood why no one had seemed particularly anxious to reach me. I kept my voice level as I came up the front walk. "What is that?" "It's a sign," Danny said, not looking up from her phone. "I can see it's a sign. Why is it in my yard?" My mother set her iced coffee down on the porch railing. "Claire, honey, sit down." "I don't want to sit down." She exhaled with the long-suffering patience of someone who had practiced this conversation. "We had to make a decision. You were unreachable. The opportunity had a 48-hour window and we couldn't wait." "What opportunity?" "A buyer. Cash. Above asking." She said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis they've convinced themselves is good news. "You've been talking about upgrading for 2 years. This way you can take the equity and—" "You listed my house. It's already sold," Danny said flatly, and finally put her phone down. "Closing is in 4 days. You should actually be thanking us." I stood at the bottom of the porch steps and I looked at them, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. The same thing that happens on the platform when a gauge reading stops making sense. You don't panic. Panic is a luxury that costs lives. You start checking the system. "Walk me through it," I said. "Who authorized the listing?" My mother had power of attorney. I had given it to her 2 years ago when a crew member on our platform had a medical emergency and spent 11 days in a coma with no one able to access his finances or make decisions for him. I had been terrified by the helplessness of it. So I had done what felt responsible. I had granted my mother a durable power of attorney, general enough to cover emergencies because I trusted her. "I have POA," she said. "I listed it. It's legal." "Mom." I kept my voice very even. "POA lets you act on my behalf. It does not let you act against my interests. Selling above asking price is not against your interests. You sold my home without telling me. We tried to reach you." She had the audacity to sound wounded. "Claire, Do you have any idea what Danny is dealing with right now? And there it was. There was the load-bearing wall of the entire argument. Danny was dealing with things. Danny was always dealing with things. At 27, she had the financial stability of a college freshman and the emotional vocabulary of someone who had been told their whole life that instability was someone else's problem to solve. She had debt from a degree she hadn't finished, a car payment on a car she couldn't afford, and a boyfriend my mother described as between opportunities, with a kind of optimism that had never once been rewarded. "What does Danny need?" I asked. Danny answered for herself, which she did whenever the number was too large for my mother to say out loud. "I need to clear my debt, all of it, and start over. The sale gives us enough to do that and still leave you with equity for a new place." I want you to feel the geometry of that sentence. The sale gives us enough. She had already divided the money. In her head, in some conversation I was never invited to, my house had been liquidated and distributed. I had been consulted the way you consult a piece of furniture about whether it wants to be reupholstered. "How much is your debt?" I asked. $83,000. "And the house is selling for?" $420, my mother said. "The buyer is a property investor. She paid cash. It closed escrow pending the final paperwork. $420,000. I had bought the house for $260. I had put another $40,000 into renovations. I had watched that neighborhood slowly climb for 3 years. And someone had just bought it from my mother for $420, and Danny was going to receive $83,000 of that, and the rest was presumably going into an account my mother would manage on my behalf. Presumably. I looked at Danny's wrist. She was wearing a watch I didn't recognize. Delicate gold, a brand I knew cost somewhere between $800 and $1,200. She saw me looking and crossed her arms. "That's not from this," she said. I didn't say anything. "You had that face. Drop a comment and tell me if you would have had that face too," I said. I want to see how many people would have stood there and stayed calm. And if you've been here before, if you've had a moment where you realized the people who were supposed to love you had already done the math on you, tell me about it below. I read all of them. I didn't go inside. I didn't yell. I adjusted the strap of my duffel and said, "I need to make a phone call." My mother visibly relaxed. That was her first mistake. She thought the phone call was surrender. Here's what they didn't know. 11 months ago, I had been sitting in the platform's common room watching a documentary about a woman in Ohio who came home from a work assignment to find her sister had sold her car, her furniture, and attempted to sublet her apartment. The legal battle lasted 2 years. The sister had POA. It was a nightmare that resolved only because the apartment was under a lease, not owned outright. It made me think. I owned my house outright. A general POA was a wide door. I had given it to my mother for emergencies, but I had never defined what an emergency was, and definitions matter more than intentions in any legal document. So I had called the real estate attorney who'd handled my original purchase. I told her what I was worried about. She didn't laugh at me. She said, "You're right to be cautious." And she walked me through something called a revocable living trust. The concept is straightforward. Instead of owning the house in your own name, you transfer the title into a trust. You are both the grantor and the trustee. The house is still functionally yours in every way that matters. But here's the critical piece. A power of attorney grants authority over you, the individual. It does not grant authority over a trust. The trust is a separate legal entity. To act on behalf of the trust, a person would need to be named as a successor trustee. My mother was not named as a successor trustee. I had named my attorney. I had transferred the title 8 months ago. My attorney had the certified deed. I had a copy in the cloud, in 2 email drafts I'd never sent, and on a flash drive in my duffel bag that I had carried through every rotation since. Not because I was paranoid, but because I had learned on an oil rig that redundancy is not fear. Redundancy is professionalism. I walked around the side of the house to the backyard, ostensibly to make my phone call in private. What I was actually doing was buying myself 4 minutes to confirm what I suspected. I pulled up my files on my phone, opened the scanned deed, and read the title. Claire A. 8, Merritt, trustee of the Claire A. Merritt Revocable Living Trust. Then I called my attorney. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I was looking at, She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the practiced calm of someone who processes other people's crises for a living, the sale is invalid. Your mother had no authority to transfer trust property. Any contract signed under her POA for this property is legally unenforceable. The buyer wired cash, it cleared. That doesn't change the underlying validity of the contract. It just means the buyer has a fraud claim against your mother. She paused. Claire, I'm going to need you to not sign anything. I'm also going to need you to let me make a call before you go back out there. Who are you calling? The buyer's attorney, if she has one. And possibly the escrow company, if the escrow company dispersed funds on a fraudulent title transfer. They have liability exposure. They're going to want to know about this immediately. I stood in my backyard for 11 minutes. The garden beds I had dug were starting to show the first green of things I had planted in the fall, pushing up through soil I had turned by hand. I looked at them and thought about the woman on the oil rig documentary. 2 years. I thought about how much of my life I had already spent solving problems that other people created. Then I went back inside. The buyer was in the kitchen. Her name was Margaret, and she was the type of investor who wore good shoes to property walkthroughs. She had the deed on the counter in front of her, and she was going over it with a pen. And she looked up at me with the politely firm expression of someone who has been warned that a family member might make things complicated. You must be Claire, she said. Your mother mentioned you might come by. I want you to know I think this has been a very clean transaction. The paperwork is all in order. Is the title search complete? I asked. She blinked. Your mother had a clean POA and a valid. I didn't ask about the POA. I asked about the title search. Margaret looked at my mother. My mother looked at the floor. We waived it, Margaret said, the first tremor of something uncertain in her voice. Cash deals move fast. I've done dozens of these. The POA was documented. I wasn't concerned about. I took the flash drive out of my duffel. I had a small travel adapter in my bag, and my laptop was in the same pocket. I set it on the kitchen table, opened the certified deed transfer, and turned to the screen to face her. She leaned forward. I watched her read the trust language. I watched her read the date of transfer. I watched the clean investor certainty in her expression begin to do what certainty always does when it meets a fact it didn't account for. The Claire A. Merritt Revocable Living Trust, I said quietly. Established and recorded 8 months ago, my mother has general power of attorney over me as an individual. She has no authority whatsoever over assets held in this trust. The signature on your purchase contract is not a valid conveyance. You did not buy this house. Margaret straightened up very slowly. She looked at my mother. My mother's face had gone the particular gray of someone watching a situation they thought they controlled turn into something that has its own momentum now. Dorothy, Margaret said, and her voice had the structure of someone choosing words very, very carefully. You told me you had full authority. She believed she did, I said, because I have never been interested in cruelty for its own sake. She was wrong. I wired $420,000, Margaret said. Her voice was still controlled, but I could hear the seams in it. This morning, it cleared. I know. My attorney is on the phone with the escrow company right now. Give me my money back. She turned to my mother, and the controlled voice was gone. Reverse the transfer. Right now. My mother looked at Danny. Danny looked at the new watch on her wrist. A silence stretched out in my kitchen that had the particular texture of a moment when everyone in a room understands at the same time that something is unfixable. We already moved it, Danny said. Moved it where? Margaret's voice was sharp now. Most of it went to settle accounts. My mother's voice was barely audible. We handled Danny's debt. There were some other things we needed to take care of. We thought once you understood, Claire, you spent it, I said. Not accusatory, just factual. The way you'd read a gauge, not all of it. How much is left? The number my mother gave me was not $420,000. It was not even close to $420,000. Margaret pulled out her phone. She was dialing before she finished turning away from me. She spoke to someone on the other end in a low, continuous voice, and the words I could make out were fraud and wire transfer and attorney. She walked out the front door and stood on the porch, and I could hear her through the window. and the conversation was not going well for anyone in that kitchen. Danny stood up. "You could stop this," she said. "Tell her it was a miscommunication. We'll pay it back. We'll work out a payment plan." "From what income?" I asked. "Claire." My mother reached for my arm. "Family takes care of family. You have always had more than you needed. You've been saying for 2 years you wanted a bigger place. This was going to help everyone. I want to tell you about the specific quality of that moment. Not the anger of it, because the anger was actually very quiet by then. I mean the clarity, the specific architectural clarity of finally seeing a structure you've been living inside of without ever looking at the walls. They had not made one reckless decision. They had made a series of decisions, each one building on the last, and every single one of them had assumed that I would absorb the cost. Not because they didn't love me, or not only because of that, but because I always had. I had trained them to do it by never once making it painful enough to stop. That ended today. "I'm not going to tell her it was a miscommunication," I said, because it wasn't. Margaret came back inside. Behind her, the escrow officer was calling the title company. There were now 4 separate legal entities who had been notified that a fraudulent property transfer had occurred in the past 24 hours, and the money had already moved. Margaret had also, I would learn later, called her own attorney, who had called the district attorney's office by end of business that day. My mother and Danny hired a lawyer within 48 hours. It didn't help as much as they hoped. The wire transfer across state lines was a federal matter as much as a state one. Fraud is fraud regardless of the relationship between the parties. The escrow company was cooperating fully because they had their own exposure to manage. Margaret was not interested in the payment plan, but I want to tell you about the moment before all of that. The moment that I think about when I'm back on the platform at 2 in the morning and the wind is doing something violent to the outer hull and I'm trying to remember what solid ground feels like. Danny blocked the hallway. She had her phone out. On the screen was a text thread she had apparently been composing for a while, addressed to my supervisor at the contracting company. The text made accusations about equipment I had allegedly falsified inspection reports on, about safety violations I had supposedly covered up, about federal maritime regulations I had supposedly breached, specific details. Dates, reference numbers that were close enough to real formats to pass a first glance. "Drop the complaint," she said. "Tell Margaret it was a family misunderstanding and sign over the equity or I send this." I looked at her. My little sister, who I had driven to prom, who I had helped move 3 times, who I had visited in a hospital after her appendix. I looked at her holding that phone like a weapon, and I tried to find the person I had grown up with inside the person standing there. "Send it," I said. She stared at me. "Danny, send it. Right now if you want." "I will." "Okay. And when you do, make sure you understand that every single inspection report I have filed in 6 years is logged in a federal maritime database with timestamps, digital signatures, and third-party verification. That my company does quarterly audits with an independent contractor. That none of the reference numbers you used correspond to actual reports because I checked while you were talking. And that sending a fraudulent report to a federal contractor about falsified safety documentation is itself a federal offense. I paused. "So please, send it." Her thumb hovered, then her hand dropped. I stepped around her and walked to the front door. I want to be honest with you about what came after, because these stories have a tendency to end in a clean, triumphant frame, and real life tends to be messier than that. The legal process took most of a year. Margaret recovered the majority of her money through the escrow company's insurance and a civil judgment against my mother, who had to liquidate retirement savings and sell her car to satisfy it. Danny's debt, the debt that had started all of this, did not get cleared. She is paying it down herself now for the first time in her adult life. My mother and I speak occasionally. It is not warm. I don't know if it will ever be what it was, and I've stopped predicting either outcome. The house is still mine. I walked through every room that evening after everyone had gone and the lock had been rekeyed and the porch was empty and quiet. I stood in the kitchen where all of it had happened, and I looked at the walls I had patched myself and the floors I had refinished on a rented sander. I barely knew how to operate, and I tried to feel triumphant. I didn't, exactly. What I felt was more like the absence of a weight I had gotten so used to carrying that I'd stopped noticing it was there. I changed the alarm code. I made a pot of coffee. I sat on the back porch in the dark and listened to the neighborhood, and for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel responsible for everyone in it. There's something I learned on the rigs that I keep coming back to. We have a saying about equipment checks. You don't do them because you're afraid the equipment has already failed. You do them because you know it might, and because the cost of being unprepared is always higher than the cost of the check. Trust people. Love people, but review the structure that trust is built on, because love without structure is just hope, and hope does not hold up in a Category 3 North Atlantic storm. If you have ever had to protect yourself from someone who counted on you not to, you already know what I mean. If you're in the middle of it right now, I want you to know that the document exists. The structure can be built. And the person who benefits most from you believing it's too late to prepare is always the person who is planning to arrive after the preparation window has closed. I went to bed that night in my own house, in a room I had painted a color called Quiet Harbor, and I slept for 11 hours straight. No dreams I can remember. I was back offshore in 18 days. On the cab ride to the airport, I looked out the window at the neighborhoods moving past, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Like I was leaving something I would actually come back to.